Hi everyone! Welcome back to Pages of the Globe. Today I'm going to be reading to you the short story called Hell Heaven by Jhumpha Lahri. Now this story is an interesting short story to read about. In it, it's about a girl named Usha, who is a child of immigrants, who must adapt to the American way of living. Now this is a common theme in Jhumpha Lahri's writing, and you'll see a lot of times that she writes about immigrants coming from India. Now this is not an easy task for Usha to do, which is adapting to the American way of living, but she believes that she can do it with no problems. As a child, she always wanted to do things that she had seen other American children doing, but her mother Baldi did not think the same way she did about that. Her mother wanted her to stay true to her roots and do things she would have done if they were back home in Bengal. As Usha begins to get older, she starts to make her own decisions about what she wants to do rather than her mom making them for her. And she doesn't really care if her mom likes it or not. The main plot in this story has to do with this guy named Pranab Kaku, who isn't actually Usha's uncle, which Kaku means uncle in Bengali, but he's not actually Usha's uncle. But in a way, Usha's family has adopted him because he's also come from India to go to MIT, and it is very hard for him to adapt to the American way. Now, Usha's mother, Baldi, falls in love with him, but when Pranab Kaku decides to start a relationship with an American woman named Deborah, things get really complicated. Now, I'm going to give you a brief introduction about the amazing author Jhumpha Lahri, who writes many amazing short stories. Jhumpha Lahri was born on July 11th, 1967 in London, England. She's an English-born American novelist and short story writer whose works illuminate the immigrant experiences, in particular that of East Indians, as I said before. Lahri is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of several books. She was presented a National Humanities Medal by the U.S. President Barack Obama in 2015. She graduated from Boston University with graduate degrees in English, creative writing, and comparative literature. In 2000, Lahri became the youngest recipient in the history of the Pulitzer Prizes to receive the award in fiction for her first collection of stories, The Interpreter of Maladies. Her first novel, The Namesake, was published in 2003. She returned to short stories with the #1 New York Times bestseller, Unaccustomed Earth, and Hell Heaven actually comes from that collection of short stories. In 2013, she returned with The Lowland, which became a National Book Award finalist and was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. Hell Heaven itself was published in 2015, along with other short stories in the collection Unaccustomed Earth. Now, I don't want to reveal too much about this story, so let's get started. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And comment down below which short story you'd like to hear next, because I would love to read whatever stories you guys might want to listen to. Hell Heaven by Jhumpha Lahri. Pranab Chakraborty wasn't technically my father's younger brother. He was a fellow Bengali from Calcutta who had washed up on the barren shores of my parents' social life in the early 70s when they lived in a rented apartment in Central Square and could number their acquaintances on one hand. But I had no real uncles in America, and so I was taught to call him Pranab Kaku. Accordingly, he called my father Shamalda, always addressing him in the polite form, and he called my mother Baudi, which is how Bengalis are supposed to address an older brother's wife instead of using her first name, Aparna. After Pranab Kaku was befriended by my parents, he confessed that on the day we first met him, he had followed my mother and me for the better part of an afternoon around the streets of Cambridge, where she and I tended to roam after I got out of school. He had trailed behind us along Massachusetts Avenue and in and out of the Harvard Coop, where my mother liked to cook at discounted housewares. He wandered with us into Harvard Yard, where my mother often sat on the grass on pleasant days and watched the stream of students and professors filing busily along the paths, until finally, as we were climbing the steps to the Widener library so I could use the bathroom, he tapped my mother on the shoulder and inquired in English, a Bengali. The answer to his question was clear, given that my mother was wearing the red and white bangles unique Bengali married women, and a common Tangal sari, and had a thick stem of vermilion powder in the center parting of her hair, and the full round face and large dark eyes that were so typical of Bengali women. He noticed the 2 or 3 safety pins she wore fastened to the thin gold bangles that were behind the red and white ones, which she would have used to replace a missing hook on a blouse or to draw a string through a petticoat at moment's notice, a practice he associated strictly with his mother and sisters and aunts in Calcutta. Moreover, Pranab Kaku had overheard my mother speaking to me in Bengali, telling me that I couldn't buy an issue of Archie at the Coop. But back then, he also confessed that he was new to America, that he took nothing for granted and doubted even the obvious. My parents and I had lived in Central Square for 3 years prior to that day. Before that, we lived in Berlin, where I was born and where my father had finished his training in microbiology before accepting a position as a researcher at Mass General. And before Berlin, my mother and father had lived in India, where they had been strangers to each other and where their marriage had been arranged. Central Square is the first place I can recall living, and in my memories of our apartment, in the dark brown shingled house on Ashburton Place, Pranab Kaku is always there. According to the story, he liked to recall often that my mother invited him to accompany us back to our apartment that very afternoon and prepare tea for the 2 of them. Then, after learning that he had not had a proper Bengali meal in more than 3 months, she served him the leftover curried mackerel and rice that we had eaten for dinner the night before. He remained into the evening for a second dinner after my father got home, and after he showed up for dinner almost every night, occupying the 4th chair at our square Formica kitchen table, and becoming a part of our family in practice as well as in name. He was from a wealthy family in Calcutta, and had never had to do so much as pour himself a glass of water before moving to America to study engineering at MIT. Life as a graduate student in Boston was a cruel shock, and in his first month he lost nearly 20 pounds. He had arrived in January in the middle of a snowstorm. At the end of a week, he had packed his bags and gone to Logan, prepared to abandon the opportunity he'd worked toward all his life, only to change his mind at the last minute. He was living in Trowbridge Street, in the home of a divorced woman with 2 young children who were always screaming and crying. He rented a room in the attic and was permitted to use the kitchen only at specified times of the day, and instructed to always wipe down the stove with Windex and a sponge. My parents agreed that it was a terrible situation, and if they'd had a bedroom to spare, they would have offered it to him. Instead, they welcomed him to our meals and opened up our apartment to him at any time, and soon it was there he went between classes and on his days off, always leaving some vestige of himself. A nearly finished pack of cigarettes, a newspaper, a piece of mail he had not bothered to open, a sweater he had taken off and forgotten in the course of his stay. I remember vividly the sound of his exuberant laughter and the sight of his lanky body slouched or sprawled on the dull mismatched furniture that had come with our apartment. He had a striking face, with a high forehead and a thick mustache and overgrown untamed hair that my mother said made him look like the American hippies who were everywhere in those days. His long legs jiggled rapidly up and down wherever he sat, and his elegant hands trembled when he held a cigarette between his fingers, tapping the ashes into a teacup that my mother began to set aside for this exclusive purpose. Though he was a scientist by training, there was nothing rigid or predictable or orderly about him. He always seemed to be starving, walking through the door and announcing that he hadn't had lunch. Then he would eat ravenously, reaching behind my mother to steal cutlets as she was frying them, before she had a chance to set them properly on a plate with red onion salad. In private, my parents remarked that he was a brilliant student, a star at Jadavpur, who had come to MIT with an impressive assistantship. But Pranab Kaku was cavalier about his classes, skipping them with frequency. "These Americans are learning equations I knew at Usha's age," he would complain. He was stunned that my second-grade teacher didn't assign homework, and that at the age of 7 I hadn't been yet taught square roots or the concept of pi. He appeared without warning, never phoning beforehand, but simply knocking on the door the way people in Calcutta did, and calling out, "Baudi," as he waited for my mother to let him in. Before we met him, I would return from school to find my mother with her purse in her lap and her trench coat on, desperate to escape the apartment where she had spent the day alone. But now I would find her in the kitchen rolling out dough for luchis, which she normally made only on Sundays for my father and me, or putting up new curtains she had bought at Woolworth. I didn't know back then that Pranab Kaku's visits were what my mother looked forward to all day, that she changed into a new sari and combed her hair in anticipation of his arrival, and that she planned days in advance the snacks she would serve him with such nonchalance, that she lived for the moment she heard him call out, "Baudi," from the porch, and that she was in a foul humor on the days he didn't materialize. It must have pleased her that I looked forward to his visits as well. He showed me card tricks and an optical illusion in which he appeared to be severing his own thumb with an enormous struggle and strength, and taught me to memorize the multiplication tables well before I had to learn them in school. His hobby was photography. He owned an expensive camera that required thought before you pressed the shutter, and I quickly became his favorite subject. Round-faced, missing teeth, my thick bangs in need of a trim. They are still the pictures of myself I like best, for they convey that confidence of youth that I no longer possess, especially in front of a camera. I remember having to run back and forth in Harvard Yard as he stood with the camera trying to capture me in motion or posing on the steps of the university buildings and on the street and against the trunks of trees. There's only one photograph in which my mother appears. She is holding me as I sit, straddling her lap, her head tilted toward me, her hands pressed toward my ears, as if to prevent me from hearing something. In that picture, Pranab Kaku's shadow, his two arms raised at angles to hold the camera to his face, hovers in the corner of the frame, his darkened, featureless shape superimposed on one side of my mother's body. It was always the three of us. I was always there when he visited. It would have been inappropriate for my mother to receive him in the apartment alone. This was something that went without saying. They had in common all the things she and my father did not: a love of music, film, leftist politics, poetry. They were from the same neighborhood in North Calcutta, their family homes within walking distance. The facades familiar to them once the exact locations were described. They knew the same shops, the same bus, the tram routes, the same hole in walls for the best jalebis and Mughlai parathas. My father, on the other hand, came from a suburb 20 miles outside of Calcutta, an area that my mother considered the wilderness, and even in her bleakest hours of homesickness, she was grateful that my father had at least spared her a life in the stern house of her in-laws, where she would have had to keep her head covered with the end of her sari at all times, and use an outhouse that was nothing but a raised platform with a hole, and where in the rooms there was not a single painting hanging over the walls. Within a few weeks, Pranab Kaku had brought his reel-to-reel over to our apartment, and he played for my mother medley after medley of songs from the Hindi films of their youth. They were cheerful songs of courtship, which transformed the quiet life in our apartment and transported my mother back to the world she'd left behind in order to marry my father. She and Pranab Kaku would try to recall which scene in which movie the songs were from, and who the actors were and what they were wearing. My mother would describe Raj Kapoor and Nargis singing under umbrellas in the rain, or Dev Anand strumming a guitar on the beach in Goa. She and Pranab Kaku would argue passionately about these matters, raising their voices in playful combat, confronting each other in a way she and my father never did. Because he played the part of a younger brother, she felt free to call him Pranab, whereas she never called my father by his first name. My father was 37 then, 9 years older than my mother. Pranab Kaku was 25. My father was monkish by nature, a lover of silence and solitude. He had married my mother to placate his parents. They were willing to accept his desertion as long as he had a wife. He was wedded to his work, his research, and he existed in a shell that neither my mother nor I could penetrate. Conversation was a chore for him. It required an effort he preferred to expend at the lab. He disliked excess in anything, voiced no cravings or needs apart from the frugal elements in his daily routine. Cereal and tea in the morning, a cup of tea after he got home, and 2 different dishes every night with dinner. He did not eat with the reckless appetite of Pranab Kaku. My father had a survivor's mentality. From time to time he liked to remark in mixed company, and often with no relevant provocation, that starving Russians under Stalin had resorted to eating the glue off the back of their wallpaper. One might think that he would have felt slightly jealous, or at the very least suspicious about the regularity of Pranab Kaku's visits and the effect they had on my mother's behaviors and mood. But my guess is that my father was grateful to Pranab Kaku for the companionship he provided, freed from the sense of responsibility he must have felt for forcing her to leave India, and relieved perhaps to see her happy for a change. In the summer, Pranab Kaku bought a navy blue Volkswagen Beetle and began to take my mother and me for drives through Boston and Cambridge, and soon outside the city, flying down the highway. He would take us to India, Tea and Spices in Watertown, and once he drove us all the way to New Hampshire to look at the mountains. As the weather grew hotter, we started going once or twice a week to Walden Pond. My mother always prepared a picnic of hard-boiled eggs and cucumber sandwiches and talked fondly about the winter picnics of her youth, grand expeditions, with 50 of her relatives all taking the train into the West Bengal countryside. Pranab Kaku listened to these stories with interest, absorbing the vanishing details of her past. He did not turn a deaf ear to her nostalgia like my father, or listen uncomprehendingly like me. At Walden Pond, Pranab Kaku would coax my mother through the woods and lead her down the steep slope to the water's edge. She would unpack the picnic things and sit and watch us as we swam. His chest was matted with thick, dark hair all the way down to his waist. He was an odd sight with his pole-thin legs and a small, flaccid belly, like an otherwise svelte woman who has had a baby and not bothered to tone her abdomen. "You're making me fat, Aboudi," he would complain after gorging himself on my mother's cookings. He swam noisily, clumsily, his head always above the water. He didn't know how to blow bubbles or hold his breath, as I had learned in swimming class. Wherever we went, any stranger would naturally assume that Pranab Kaku was my father, that my mother was his wife. It is clear to me now that my mother was in love with him. He wooed her as no other man had, with the innocent affection of a brother-in-law. In my mind, he was just a family member, a cross between an uncle and a much older brother, for in certain respects my parents sheltered and cared for him in much the same way they cared for me. He was respectful of my father, always seeking his advice about making a job in the West, about setting up a bank account and getting a job, and deferring to his opinions about Kissinger and Watergate. Occasionally, my mother would tease him about women, asking him about female Indian students at MIT or showing him pictures of her younger cousin in India. "What do you think of her?" she would ask. "Isn't she pretty?" She knew that she could never have Pranab Kaku for herself, and I suppose it was her attempt to keep him in the family. But most important, in the beginning he was totally dependent on her, needing her for those months in a way my father never did in the whole history of their marriage. He brought to my mother the first, and I suspect that the only pure happiness she felt. I don't think even my birth made her as happy. I was evidence of her marriage to my father, an assumed consequence of the life she had been raised to lead. But Pranab Kaku was different. He was the one totally unanticipated pleasure in her life. In the fall of 1974, Pranab Kaku met a student at Radcliffe named Deborah, an American, and she began to accompany him to our house. I called Deborah by her first name as my parents did, but Pranab Kaku taught her to call my father Shamalda and my mother Baudi, something which Deborah gladly complied. Before they came to dinner for the first time, I asked my mother as she was straightening up the living room if I ought to address her as Deborah Kakima, turning her into an aunt as I turned Pranab into an uncle. "What's the point?" my mother said, looking back at me sharply. "In a few weeks the fun will be over and she will leave him." And yet Deborah remained by his side, attending the weekend parties that Pranab Kaku and my parents were becoming more involved with, gatherings that were exclusively Bengali, with the exception of her. Deborah was very tall, taller than both of my parents, and nearly as tall as Pranab Kaku. She wore her long brass-colored hair center-parted, as my mother did, but it gathered in a low ponytail instead of a braid, or it spilled messily over her shoulders, down her back in a way that my mother considered indecent. She wore small silver spectacles and not a trace of makeup, and she studied philosophy. I found her utterly beautiful, but according to my mother she had spots on her face and her hips were too small. For a while, Pranab Kaku still showed up once a week for dinner on his own, mostly asking my mother what she thought of Deborah. He sought her approval, telling her that Deborah was the daughter of the professors at Boston College, that her father published poetry, and that both of her parents had PhDs. When he wasn't around, my mother complained about Deborah's visits, about having to make the food less spicy, even though Deborah said she liked spicy food, and feeling embarrassed to put a fried fish head in the dal. Pranab Kaku taught Deborah to say kubpalu and acha, and to pick up certain foods with her fingers rather than fork. Sometimes they ended up feeding each other, allowing their fingers to linger in each other's mouths, causing my parents to look down at their plates and wait for the moment to pass. At larger gatherings, they kissed and held hands in front of everyone, and when they were out of earshot, my mother would talk to other Bengali women. He used to be so different. I don't understand how a person could change so suddenly. It's just hell heaven, the difference, she would say, always using the English words for her self-concocted backward metaphor. The more my mother began to resent Deborah's visits, the more I began to anticipate them. I fell in love with Deborah, the way young girls often fall in love with women who are not their mothers. I loved her serene gray eyes, the ponchos, the denim wrap skirts, the sandals she wore, her straight hair that she let me manipulate into all sorts of silly styles. I longed for her casual appearance. My mother insisted wherever there was a gathering, I wear one of my ankle-length, faintly Victorian dresses which she referred to as maxis, and have party hair, which meant taking a strand from either side of my head and joining them with a barrette at the back. At parties, Deborah would eventually politely slip away, much to the relief of Bengali women with whom she was expected to carry on a conversation, as she would play with me. I was older than all my parents' friends' children, but with Deborah I had a companion. She knew about all the books I read, about Pippi Longstocking and Anne of Green Gables. She gave me the sort of gifts my parents neither had the money nor the inspiration to buy. A large book of Grimm's fairy tales with watercolor illustrations on the thick silken pages, wooden puppets with hair fashioned from yarn. She told me about her family, 3 older sisters and 2 younger brothers, the youngest of whom was closer to my age than hers. Once, after visiting her parents, she bought back 3 Nancy Drews, her name written in a girlish hand at the top of the first page, and an old toy she'd had, a small paper theater set with interchangeable backdrops, the exterior of a castle, and a ballroom and an open field. Deborah and I spoke freely in English, a language in which by that age I expressed myself more easily than in Bengali, which I was required to speak at home. Sometimes she asked me how to say this or that in Bengali. Once she asked me what asobo meant. I hesitated, then told her it was what my mother called me if I had done something extremely naughty. Deborah's face clouded. I felt protective of her, aware that she was unwanted, that she was resented, aware of the nasty things people said. Outings in the Volkswagen now involved the 4 of us, Deborah in the front, her hand over Pranab Kaku's while it rested on the gear shift, and my mother in the back. Soon, my mother began coming up with reasons to excuse herself, headaches and incipient colds, and so I became a part of a new triangle. To my surprise, my mother allowed me to go with them to the Museum of Fine Arts and to the public garden and the aquarium. She was waiting for the affair to end, for Deborah to break Pranab Kaku's heart, and for him to return to us scarred and penitent. I saw no sign of their relationship foundering. Their open affection for each other, their easily expressed happiness, was a new romantic thing to me. Having me in the back seat allowed Pranab Kaku and Deborah to practice for the future, to try on the idea of a family of their own. Countless photographs were taken of me and Deborah, sitting on Deborah's lap, holding her hand, kissing her on the cheek. We exchanged what I believe were secret smiles, and in those moments I felt that she understood me better than anyone else in the world. Anyone would have said that Deborah would make an excellent mother one day, but my mother refused to acknowledge such a thing. I did not know at the time that my mother allowed me to go off with Pranab Kaku and Deborah because she was pregnant for the 5th time since my birth and was so sick and exhausted and fearful of losing another baby that she slept most of the day. After 10 weeks, she miscarried again and was advised by her doctor to stop trying. By summer, there was a diamond on Deborah's left hand, something my mother had never been given. Because his own family lived so far away, Pranab Kaku came to the house alone one day to ask for my parents' blessing before giving her the ring. He showed us the box, opening it and taking out the diamond nestled inside. "I want to see how it looks on someone," he said, urging my mother to try it on, but he refused. I was the one who stuck out my hand, feeling the weight of the ring suspended at the base of my finger. Then he asked for a second thing. He wanted my parents to write to his parents, saying that they had met Deborah and that they thought highly of her. He was nervous, naturally, about telling his family that he intended to marry an American girl. He had told his parents all about us, and at one point my parents had received a letter form from them expressing appreciation for taking such good care of their son, for giving him a proper home in America. It needn't be long, Pranab Kaku said, just a few lines. They'll accept it more easily if it comes from you. My father thought neither ill or well of Deborah, never commenting or criticizing as my mother did, but he assured Pranab Kaku that a letter of endorsement would be on its way to Calcutta by the end of the week. My mother nodded her assent, but the following day I saw the teacup Pranab Kaku had used all this time as an ashtray in the kitchen garbage in pieces, and 3 band-aids taped to my mother's hands. Pranab Kaku's parents were horrified by the thought of their only son marrying an American woman. And a few weeks later, our telephone rang in the middle of the night. It was Mr. Chakraborty telling my father that they could not possibly bless such a marriage, that it was out of question that Pranab Kaku had dared to marry Deborah. He would no longer acknowledge him as a son. Pranab Kaku's parents were horrified by the thought of their only son marrying an American woman, and a few weeks later our telephone rang in the middle of the night. It was Mr. Chakraborty telling my father that they could not possibly bless such a marriage, that it was out of the question, that if Pranab Kaku dared to marry Deborah, that he would no longer acknowledge him as a son. Then his wife got on the phone, asking to speak for my mother, and attacked her as if they were intimate, blaming my mother for allowing this affair to develop. She said that they had already chosen a wife for him in Calcutta, that he'd left for America with the understanding that he'd go back after he'd finished his studies and marry this girl. They had bought the neighboring flat in the building for Pranab and his betrothed, and it was sitting empty waiting for his return. "We thought we could trust you, and yet you have betrayed us so deeply," his mother said, taking out her anger on a stranger in a way she could not with her son. "Is this what happens to people in America?" For Pranab Kaku's sake, my mother defended the engagement, telling his mother that Deborah was a polite girl from a decent family. Pranab Kaku's parents pleaded with mine to talk him out of the engagement, but my father refused, deciding that it was not their place to get embroiled in a situation that had nothing to do with them. "We are not his parents," he told my mother. "We can tell him they don't approve, but nothing more." And so my parents told Pranab Kaku nothing about how his parents had berated them and blamed them and threatened them to disown Pranab Kaku, only that they refused to give him their blessing. In the face of this refusal, Pranab Kaku shrugged. "I don't care. Not everyone can be as open-minded as you," he told my parents. "Your blessing is blessing enough." After the engagement, Pranab Kaku and Deborah began drifting out of our lives. They moved in together to an apartment in Boston, in the South End, a part of the city which my parents considered unsafe. We moved as well to a house in Natick. Though my parents had bought the house, they occupied it as if they were still tenants, touching up the scuff marks with leftover paint, and reluctant to put holes in the wall. And every afternoon when the sun shone through the living room window, my mother closed the blinds so that our new furniture wouldn't fade. A few weeks before the wedding, my parents invited Pranab Kaku to the house alone, and my mother prepared a special meal to mark the end of his bachelorhood. It would be the only Bengali aspect of the wedding. The rest of it would be strictly American, with a cake and a minister, and Deborah in a long white dress and veil. There's a photograph of the dinner taken by my father, the only picture to my knowledge, in which my mother and Pranab Kaku appear together. The picture is slightly blurry. I remember Pranab Kaku explaining to my father how to work the camera, and so he is captured looking up from the kitchen table and the elaborate array of food my mother had prepared in his honor, his mouth open, his long arm outstretched and his finger pointing, instructing my father how to read the light meter or some such thing. My mother stands beside him, one hand placed on top of his head in a gesture of blessing, the first and last time she was to touch him in her life. She will leave him, my mother told her friends afterward. She is throwing his life away. The wedding was in a church at Ipswich, with a reception at a country club. It was going to be a small ceremony, which my parents took to mean 100 or 200 people as opposed to 300 or 400. My mother was shocked that fewer than 30 people had been invited, and she was more perplexed than honored that of all the Bengalis Pranab Kaku knew, we were the only ones on the list. At the wedding, we sat, like the other guests, first on the hard wooden pews of the church, and then at a long table that had been set up for us at lunch. Though we were the closest thing Pranab Kaku had to a family that day, we were not included in the group photographs that were taken on the grounds of the country club, with Deborah's parents and grandparents and her many siblings, and neither my mother nor father got up to make a toast. My mother did not appreciate the fact that Deborah had made sure that my parents, who did not eat beef, were given fish instead of filet mignon like everybody else. She kept speaking in Bengali, complaining about the formality of proceedings and the fact that Pranab Kaku, wearing a tuxedo, barely said a word to us because he was too busy leaning over the shoulder of his new American in-laws as he circled the table. As usual, my father said nothing in response to my mother's commentary, quietly and methodically working through his meal, his fork and knife occasionally squeaking against the surface of the china, because he was accustomed to eating with his hands. He cleared his plate and then my mother's, for she had pronounced that the food inedible, and then he announced that he had overeaten and had a stomachache. The only time my mother forced a smile was when Deborah appeared behind her chair, kissing her on the cheek and asking if we were enjoying ourselves. When the dancing started, my parents remained at the table, drinking tea, and after 2 or 3 songs they decided it was time for us to go home, my mother shooting me looks to that effect across the room where I was dancing in a circle with Pranab Kaku and Deborah and the other children at the wedding. I wanted to stay, and when reluctantly I walked over to where my parents sat, Deborah followed me. "Baldi, let Usha stay. She's having such a good time," she said to my mother. "Lots of people will be heading back your way. Some can drop her off in a little while." But my mother said no. I had had plenty of fun already and forced me to put on my coat over my long puff-sleeved dress. As we drove home from the wedding, I told my mother for the first but not the last time in my life that I hated her. The following year, we received a birth announcement from the Chakrabortis, a picture of twin girls, which my mother did not paste into an album or display on the refrigerator door. The girls were named Sarbani and Sabriti, but were called Bonnie and Sarah. Apart from a thank you card for our wedding gift, it was their only communication. We were not invited to the new house in Marblehead, bought after Pranab Kaku got a high-paying job at Stone and Webster. For a while, my parents and their friends continued to invite the Chakrabortis to gatherings, but because they never came, or left after staying only an hour, the invitation stops. Their absences were attributed by my parents and their circle to Deborah, and it was universally agreed that she had stripped Pranab Kaku not only of his origins but of his independence. She was the enemy, he was her prey, and their example was invoked as a warning, as a vindication, that mixed marriages were a doomed enterprise. Occasionally they surprised everyone, appearing at a puja for a few hours with their 2 identical little girls who barely looked Bengali and spoke only English, and were being raised so differently from me and most of the other children. They were not taken to Calcutta every summer. They did not have parents who were clinging to another way of life and exhorting their children to do the same. Because of Deborah, they were exempt from all that, and for this reason I envied them. "Usha, look at you. You look so grown up and pretty," Deborah would say whenever she saw me, rekindling, if only for a minute, our bond of years before. She had cut off her beautiful long hair by then and had a bob. "I bet you will be old enough to babysit soon," she would say. "I'll call you. The girls would love that." But she never did. I began to grow out of my girlhood, entering middle school, developing crushes on the American boys in my class. The crushes amounted to nothing in spite of Deborah's compliments. I was always overlooked at that age, but my mother must have picked up on something, for she forbade me to attend the dances that were held the last Friday of the month in the school cafeteria, and it was an unspoken law that I was not allowed to date. "Don't you think you'll get away with marrying an American the way Pranab Kaku did?" she would say from time to time. I was 13, the thought of marriage irrelevant to my life. Still, her words upset me, and I felt her grip on me tighten. She would fly into a rage when I told her I wanted to start wearing a bra, or if I wanted to go to Harvard Square with a friend. In the middle of our arguments, she often conjured Deborah as her antithesis, the sort of woman she refused to be. If she were your mother, she would let you do whatever you wanted because she wouldn't care. Is that what you want, Usha? A mother who doesn't care? When I began menstruating, the summer before I started 9th grade, my mother gave me a speech telling me that I was to let no boy touch me, and then she asked me if I knew how a woman became pregnant. I told her I'd been taught in science about the sperm fertilizing the egg, and then she asked me if I knew how exactly that happened. I saw the terror in her eyes, and so, though I knew that aspect of procreation as well, I lied and told her that it hadn't been explained to us. I began to pity my mother. The older I got, the more I saw what a desolate life she led. She'd never worked, and during the day she watched soap operas to pass the time. Her only job every day was to clean and cook for my father and me. We rarely went to restaurants, my father always pointing out, even in the cheap ones, how expensive they were compared with eating at home. When my mother complained to him about how much she hated life in the suburbs and how lonely she felt, he said nothing to placate her. "If you are so unhappy, go back to Calcutta," he would offer, making it clear that their separation would not affect him one way or the other. I began to take my cues from my father in dealing with her, isolating her doubly. When she screamed at me for taking too long on the telephone or for staying too long in my room, I learned to scream back, telling her that she was pathetic, that she knew nothing about me, and it was clear to both of us that I had stopped needing her, definitively and abruptly, just as Pranab Kaku had. Then, the year before I went off to college, my parents and I were invited to the Chakraborty's home for Thanksgiving. We were not the only guests from my parents' old Cambridge crowd. It turned out that Pranab Kaku and Deborah wanted to have a sort of reunion. Of all the people they had been friendly with back then. Normally, my parents did not celebrate Thanksgiving. The ritual of a large sit-down dinner and the foods that one was supposed to eat was lost on them. They treated it as if it were Memorial Day or Veterans Day, just another holiday in the American year. But we drove out to Marblehead to an impressive stone-faced house with a semicircle gravel driveway clogged with cars. The house was a short walk from the ocean. On our way, we had driven by the harbor overlooking the cold, glittering Atlantic. And when we stepped out of the car, we were greeted by the sounds of gulls and waves. Most of the living room furniture had been moved to the basement, and extra tables joined to the main one to form a giant U. They were covered with tablecloths, set with white plates and silverware, and had centerpieces of gourds. I was struck by the toys and dolls that were everywhere, dogs that shed long yellow hairs on everything, all the photographs of Bonnie and Sarah and Deborah decorating the walls, still more plastering the refrigerator door. Food was being prepared when we arrived, something my mother always frowned upon. The kitchen a chaos of people, and smells and enormous dirtied bowls. Deborah's family, whom we remembered dimly from the wedding, was there, her parents and her brothers and sisters and their husbands and wives and boyfriends and babies. Her sisters were in their 30s, but like Deborah, they could have been mistaken for college students wearing jeans and clogs and fishermen's sweaters, and her brother Maddie, with whom I had danced in a circle at the wedding, was now a freshman at Amherst with wide-set green eyes and wispy brown hair and a complexion that reddened easily. As soon as I saw Deborah's siblings joking with another as they chopped and stirred things in the kitchen, I was furious with my mother for making a scene before we left the house and forcing me to wear shalwar kameez. I knew they assumed from my clothing that I had more in common with the other Bengalis than them, but Deborah insisted on including me, setting me to work peeling apples with Maddie, and out of my parents' sight I was given beer to drink. When the meal was ready, we were told where to sit in an alternating boy-girl formation that made the Bengalis uncomfortable. Bottles of wine were lined on the table. 2 turkeys were brought out, one stuffed with sausage and one without. My mouth watered at the food, but I knew that afterward, on our way home, my mother would complain that it was all tasteless and bland. "Impossible," my mother said, shaking her hand over the top of her glass when someone tried to pour her a little wine. Deborah's father, Jean, got up to say grace and asked everyone at the table to join hands. He bowed his head and closed his eyes. "Dear Lord, we thank you today for the food we are about to receive," he began. My parents were seated next to each other, and I was stunned to see that they complied, that my father's brown fingers lightly clasped my mother's pale ones. I noticed Maddie seated on the other side of the room and saw him glancing at me as his father spoke. After the chorus of amens, Jean raised his glass and said, "Forgive me. I never thought I'd have the opportunity to say this. Here's to Thanksgiving with the Indians." Only a few people laughed at that joke. Then Pranab Kaku stood up and thanked everyone for coming. He was relaxed from alcohol, his once wiry body beginning to thicken. He started to talk sentimentally about his early days in Cambridge, and then suddenly he recounted the story of meeting me and my mother for the first time, telling the guests about how he had followed us that afternoon. The people who did not know us laughed, amused by the description of the encounter and by Pranab Kaku's desperation. He walked around the room to where my mother was sitting and draped a lanky arm around her shoulder, forcing her for a brief moment to stand up. "This woman," he declared, pulling her close to his side, "this woman hosted my real Thanksgiving in America. It might have been an afternoon in May, but that first meal at a Bowley's table was Thanksgiving to me. If it weren't for that meal, I would have gone back to Calcutta." My mother looked away, embarrassed. She was 38, already going gray, and she looked closer to my father's age than Pranab Kaku's. Regardless of his waistline, he retained his handsome, carefree looks. Pranab Kaku went back to his place at the head of the table next to Deborah and concluded, "And if that had been the case, I would have never met you, my darling." And he kissed her on the mouth in front of everyone, to much applause, as if it were their wedding day all over again. After the turkey, smaller forks were distributed, and orders were taken for 3 different kinds of pie, written on small pads by Deborah's sisters as if they were waitresses. After dessert, the dogs needed to go out, and Pranab Kaku volunteered to take them. "How about a walk on the beach?" he suggested, and Deborah's side of the family agreed that that was an excellent idea. None of the Bengalis wanted to go, preferring to sit with their tea and cluster together at last at one end of the room, speaking freely after the forced chit-chat with the Americans during the meal. Maddie came over and sat in the chair beside me that was now empty, encouraging me to join in the walk. When I hesitated, pointing to my inappropriate clothes and shoes, but also aware of my mother's silent fury at the sight of us together, he said, "I'm sure Deb can lend you something." So I went upstairs where Deborah gave me a pair of her jeans and a thick sweater and some sneakers so that I looked like her and her sisters. She sat on the edge of her bed watching me change as if we were girlfriends, and she asked me if I had a boyfriend. When I told her no, she said, "Maddie thinks you're cute." "He told you?" "No, but I can tell." I walked back downstairs, emboldened by this information in the jeans I'd had to roll up in, and in which I finally felt like myself. I noticed my mother lift her eyes from her teacup and stare at me, but she said nothing, and off I went with Pranab Kaku and his dogs and his in-laws along a road and then down some steep wooden steps to the water. Deborah and one of her sisters stayed behind to begin the cleanup and to see to the needs of those who remained. Initially, we all walked together in a single row across the sand, but then I noticed Maddie hanging back, so the two of us trailed behind, the distance between us and the others increasing. We began flirting, talking about things I no longer remember, and eventually we wandered into a rocky inlet, and Maddie fished a joint out of his pocket. We turned our backs to the wind and smoked it, our cold fingers touching in the process, our lips pressed to the same damp section of the rolling paper. At first, I didn't feel any effect, but then listening to him talk about the band he was in, I was aware that his voice sounded miles away, and that I had the urge to laugh, even though what he was saying was not terribly funny. It felt as if we were apart from the group for hours, but when we wandered back to the sand, we could still see them, walking out onto a promontory to watch the sun set. It was dark by the time we all headed back to the house, and I dreaded to see my parents while I was still high. But when we got there, Deborah told me that my parents, feeling tired, had left, agreeing to let someone drive me home later. A fire had been lit, and I was told to relax and have more pie, as the leftovers were put away and the living room slowly put back in order. Of course, it was Maddie who drove me home, and sitting in my parents' driveway, I kissed him, at once thrilled and terrified that my mother might walk onto the lawn in her nightgown and discover us. I gave Maddie my phone number, and for a few weeks I thought of him constantly and hoped foolishly that he would call. In the end, my mother was right. 14 years after that Thanksgiving, after 23 years of marriage, Pranab, Kaku, and Deborah got divorced. It was he who had strayed, falling in love with a married Bengali woman, destroying 2 families in the process. The other woman was someone who my parents knew, but not very well. Deborah was in her 40s by then, Bonnie and Sarah away at college. In her shock and grief, it was my mother whom Deborah turned to, calling and weeping into the phone. Somehow, through all the years, she had continued to regard us as quasi-in-laws, sending flowers when my grandparents died, and giving me a compact edition of the OED as a college graduation post. "You knew him so well. How could he do something like this?" Deborah asked my mother. And then, "Did you know something about it?" My mother answered truthfully that she did not. Their hearts had been broken by the same man, only my mother's had long ago mended, and in an odd way, as my parents approached their old age, she and my father had grown fond of each other, out of habit if nothing else. I believe my absence from this house once I left for college had something to do with this, because over the years when I visited, I noticed a warmth between my parents that had not been there before. A quiet, teasing, a solidarity, a concern when one of them fell ill. My mother and I had also made peace. She had accepted the fact that I was not only her daughter, but a child of America as well. Slowly, she accepted that I dated one American man and then another, and I slept with them, and even I lived with one, though we were not married. She welcomed my boyfriends into our home, and when things didn't work, she told me I would find someone better. After years of being idle, she decided when she turned 50 to get a degree in library science at a nearby university. On the phone, Deborah admitted something that surprised my mother. That all these years she had felt hopelessly shut out of a part of Pranab Kaku's life. "I was so horribly jealous of you back then for knowing him, understanding him in a way I never could. He turned his back on his family, on all of you. I could never get over that." She told my mother that she tried for years to get Pranab Kaku to reconcile with his parents, that she had also encouraged him to maintain ties with the other Bengalis, but he had resisted. It had been Deborah's idea to invite us to Thanksgiving. Ironically, the other women had been there too. "I hope you don't blame me for taking him away from your lives, Balvi. I always worried that you did." My mother assured Deborah that she blamed her for nothing. She confessed nothing to Deborah about her own jealousy of decades before, only that she was sorry for what had happened, that it was a sad and terrible thing for their family. She did not tell Deborah that a few weeks after Pranab Kaku's wedding, while I was at a Girl Scout meeting and my father was at work, she had gone through the house, gathering up all the safety pins that lurked in the drawers and tins, and added the few fastened to her bracelets. When she found enough, she pinned them to her sari one by one, attaching the front piece to the layer of material beneath, so no one would be able to pull the garment off her body. Then she took a can of lighter fluid and a box of kitchen matches and stepped outside into our chilly backyard, which was full of leaves needing to be raked. Over her sari, she was wearing a knee-length lilac trench coat, and to any neighbor she must have looked as though she had simply stepped out for some fresh air. She opened up the coat and removed the tip from the can of lighter fluid and doused herself, then buttoned and belted the coat. She walked over to the garbage barrel behind our house and disposed of the fluid, then returned to the middle of the yard with the box of matches in her coat pocket. For nearly an hour she stood there looking at our house, trying to work up the courage to strike a match. It was not I who saved her, or my father, but our next-door neighbor, Miss Holcombe, with whom my mother had never been particularly friendly with. She came out to rake the leaves in her yard, and was calling out to my mother and remarking how beautiful the sunset was. "I see you've been admiring it for a while now," she said. My mother agreed, and then she went back into the house. By the time my father and I came home in the early evening, she was in the kitchen boiling rice for our dinner, as if it were any other day. My mother told Deborah none of this. It was to me that she confessed, after my own heart was broken by a man I'd hoped to marry. The end.